question I would like to ask you, and it comes out of experience. Maybe we have part of our ground which is shared, so it allows me maybe to try to go deeper, to push you to go deeper in what we said, because this exposé started from a point which is when the threat is explicited. So you have actually the head of CIA which is actually pointing at you. And for me, when it happened, it was almost a relief, because we knew that this was happening actually for years. We knew that we were actually targeted, we were a priority for this agency for many years, but we had not enough visible elements to prove the world that it was actually happening. And what was happening actually, exactly what happened when Julian was in the embassy in Ecuador, was people saying, but you're locking yourself in the embassy.
You're free to walk out anytime you want, buddy.
Yeah, you have 50 policemen around the embassy, but you can walk out anytime. So I felt it existentially as a relief, like to have at least an enemy to which to oppose, and actually the end of denial from part of these well-thought, probably well-meaning people who were trying to pretend that this didn't exist. And don't you feel this is maybe the main obstacle today, in order to just like this lack of recognition of the existence of the threats and the rapport de force, you would say in France, for people who are fighting these struggles as WikiLeaks?
Bertrand Russell, who I think is one of the most important influences on some of my thinking of the 20th century, I think it was Bertrand Russell who said that he was grateful when he had been arrested because finally he could begin to write. And I think of that all the time, and especially when Pompeo gave his speech. Because, of course, what you say is true. There are these people that do a thing called sea lioning. They ask for facts and pretend that they're in good faith debating. And many people tried to suggest that Julian could simply walk out of the embassy. People who, frankly, did not care about his situation or did not know the facts about his situation, who cared not at all that the United Nations ruled that he had been held in arbitrary detention, should be freed immediately, and was subject to compensation from the British and the Swedish government. I mean, if the UN saying that, if Ecuador granting him asylum, if that wasn't clear, then yes, of course, when the director of the CIA came out and said that this is real, that helped. But those people who previously suggested that it hadn't been happening and we were all fanciful, ridiculous, self-important assholes that had made it up, the problem is that in that moment, those people switched from, it's not happening to, but you deserve it. So sure, I felt better now that I knew that the CIA considered me to be their enemy, but I don't consider them my enemy. The CIA is not my enemy. In the words of a famous British philosopher, Low-Key, I'm not anti-America. America is anti-me.
Yeah, for me it's maybe the most violent part is the fact that there is never a recognition of the fact that this denial existed beforehand. Like the incapacity of people to admit the fact they blinded themselves willingly. And my question was about how do you live when you know, but without having elements of proof that you are being targeted, surveyed? How do you manage to live in this strange world, no? In which reality doesn't correspond to what you know reality is, or the appearance of reality doesn't correspond to what reality you know what reality is?
Well, I think I said it earlier when I said I don't feel I ever came back from the summer of 2010. I mean, look, I'm damaged goods now. If nothing else, I hope that I can serve as a warning to other people. Right? I mean, who knows what will happen next, but having proof is a lot like being innocent of a thing. You think that that matters in this context, and it doesn't. Actually, having evidence doesn't change one bit about those people who suggested that it wasn't real and then that we deserved it. The evidence didn't change their opinion because they're authoritarians, often pretending to not be fascists, but who in fact are supporting things like the death penalty, very clearly for Julian and for other people. And so the idea that we needed this proof to show the world in some way, of course it does give a little bit of satisfaction, but you know, what kind of satisfaction do you have when you can play that video? Because it is the director of the CIA talking about how essentially he wants to kill Julian Assange. I mean, it's a real bitter satisfaction, to be honest. Yep, it's real. Uh-oh. I mean, it's terrifying. I mean, I went very deeply into meditative practice, and I sought out a therapist, and I'd like to tell you about that, because I think it's important for especially men to talk about how they deal with emotional trauma. And I think most men don't do that because they're cowards. So I'd just like to tell you that I went and saw a therapist. And I went to the therapist's office, and I told them that I was being followed by people and that they'd broken into my house, but they didn't steal anything. They've gone for my computer accounts, you know, and I started talking about what was really happening to me. I get detained at the airport, they take my passport and photocopy it, you know, they go through my bags, they tell me how I'll be beaten in prison, and people that work with computers, they think they're tough, but just wait until you're getting raped, buddy, right? And the therapist is taking notes, you know, and I'm explaining why this is happening. I'm talking about the Iraq War. I'm talking about war crimes. I'm talking about the collateral murder video. I'm talking about how it's our generation's duty to stand up to the things that are happening. It's for us. We must do this. We must, in our generation, when we see these things happening, take responsibility. It's our country that is doing this. I mean, if America was as much of a great democracy as it presents it to, all the people that are affected by its policies would have a vote too, huh? And so the therapist is writing these notes down and then says, you know, like, well, thanks, see you next week. So I come back next week and the therapist doesn't have the notepad anymore. And he asked me to step outside of his office. And I step outside of his office and he says, I don't think it's safe here. I don't think that I can be your therapist. I Googled you. And so that, for me, is, I think, a very important and telling thing. The first moment I was there, he admitted to me that he thought I was an absolutely fucking crazy lunatic. He thought I was just making it up and totally nuts. And the thing that made it real for him, the thing that allowed him to decide that I actually didn't need to be immediately committed to a psychiatric hospital, was that he was able to find independent corroboration, where he decided that it was amazing I was doing as well as I was. He referred me to someone else, and I went and I saw this therapist. And if I hadn't had a therapist to talk with for many years, and I still see actually several, you know, on a regular basis to talk about it, what's going on, how this affects my emotional state, how I have trouble focusing, how I have trouble sleeping, how when I hear creaks in the floor, like I wonder if this is the moment we're finally gonna get raided. This is the moment where someone's finally going to kick down the door and put me in a prison. This is the moment where they're going to try to force me to testify against my friends for acts of journalism, revealing human rights abuses. You know, those therapists, they've helped. If you are doing this kind of civil disobedience where it's something so uncontroversial as publishing facts in a newspaper, having a therapist is incredibly important. And it's also extremely expensive in the United States, which is one of the other things I'm really grateful about moving to Europe for. But it's very important to talk with people, and you have to do it in a way where you don't put sources or other journalists, in my context, like, into trouble. But you have to talk about what's really going on, and if you don't do that, you won't survive it. But the other thing you have to do is you have to accept that nobody gets out of this alive. Everybody in this room is going to die within 100 years. I mean, maybe some of us will live long enough to live forever, but probably not. And I think that you just have to accept that fact, and then you have to decide what it is that you can't not do. And I couldn't sit by and watch America fight a bunch of imperialist wars that were just about killing Muslims for racist reasons. Not for justice, but for revenge. You know, I couldn't sit by and see that. That's not the America that I grew up in, and I reject it fundamentally. And the thing is, when people are dying in the Mediterranean, and as was said very eloquently on the stage, that the European Union is, in fact, complicit in putting people in their internal documents as they put it into concentration camps. I think it's unfortunately the case that the same kind of action is called for here. And that means getting a job at the European Commission. It means getting involved with the organizations that do these kinds of responses, getting inside, and getting those documents out. The democratic structures in Europe are much more responsive than in America, so I think that there's still a lot of hope I mean, Brexit aside, I tend to have a lot of faith in the democratic process in Europe, and I think that if you get those documents, you can change it. And WikiLeaks has published a lot of documents about that. So if you have documents, WikiLeaks is still publishing, even though Julian Assange is imprisoned in Belmarsh prison. And if you have documents, and you're not sure how to do it technically, find someone who can help you, and then leak those documents. And if you don't like WikiLeaks' editorial policy of giving people the full documents, and you need something else, find someone else. But get into that position, even if it takes you 5 or 10 years to do it, because dark times are certainly here for a lot of the world, and it requires good people to be in those places and to be able to be custodians of that history. Those weird bureaucratic PowerPoint slides and Microsoft Word documents that describe the internal policies that are the future for many people.
And I'd like to ask you, I mean, we've seen and covered this network of mass surveillance, of espionage, of oppression systems which operate at a very high level. And we've seen how tools like Google, Facebook made themselves complicit with this system, and basically actually the system relied for much on them. And yet we have these huge movements of protest, of emancipation that still use those tools to try to escape authoritarianism. And I mean, this is a whole subject, and we'll be dealing with it with Richard Stallman tomorrow also, but I would like to ask you maybe two questions. What kind of importance should activists give for protecting their data and their confidentiality? Is it still possible? And what level of effort should they do, and what should they sacrifice in terms of capacity of linking with other people who might not be willing to do that effort immediately? That's the first one. And is it possible to conceive, the second question would be, is it possible to conceive that we will be able to build alternative tools to create these mass mobilizations without depending on these hyper-capitalistic systems which only put profit as an objective, to the point that they're enabling revolutions as long as it gives them capacity to capture audience?
These are really tough questions. I mentioned that I essentially stopped speaking in public, and that's because I'm doing doctoral research at a university in Europe, and I'm working in the mathematics department, and in this math department we work on cryptographic implementations. And I'm interested in building what are called post-quantum systems. That is something which will probably be understandable to a few people, but just to summarize it, mass surveillance is a time machine. But it's not a time machine like we think of in Back to the Future or in an H.G. Wells novel or something like that. What it is it's a time machine that when switched on, for example in the UK, all the things that travel around the internet in the UK, they're basically recorded and stored. Now they're not stored forever, but they are stored for, in some cases, many, many, many days. Just complete everything that happens, all the traffic. Like the main internet exchange in London, completely wiretapped by GCHQ. Everything you do, completely monitored. Now, in theory, some encryption might be able to help you. We've all heard about end-to-end encryption, like the things that WhatsApp has deployed, and that's going to keep us safe. Well, there's a problem. And that problem is quantum computers. And quantum computers, when they come, a universal quantum computer will be able to solve the fundamental hard problems that make cryptography difficult for someone who's watching and not participating. And what that means is that the time machine of mass surveillance, which is filled with both unencrypted data, which they can immediately act on, and encrypted data, which they can simply store, they'll be able to act on the stored data because they'll be able to decipher it. They'll be able to understand it. I think that quantum computers are probably just an engineering problem at this point. That is to say that in the very near future, there will be universal quantum computers, maybe 5, maybe 10 years. And if this is correct, if there are quantum computers, then all of the cryptography that is deployed today will be broken then. In a sense, when Mao talked about letting 1,000 flowers bloom, people couldn't have imagined that then the situation would go the way that it did. So we had all these people that were speaking openly about their politics, and then the slate got cleaned. And we are living in that same kind of era yet, and we don't yet, I think, see that. But we are living in an era where people are freely speaking on the internet about all sorts of things, and all of the proclivities of their existence and all of the desires of their life, and it's being recorded into databases. And sometimes with encryption, people are talking a little more freely than they might. And the question is, when universal quantum computers come, what will happen with that data when it's deciphered? So the research questions I'm working on are, how do we make it so that cryptography lasts through that change with quantum computers? And my primary thought is large-scale adversaries, for example, like X-Keyscore, the CIA, GCHQ, the Chinese state security, the Russian state security, whoever, right? Spying on you. How do we make it so that when they record that data, even with a quantum computer, they can't decrypt it? And there are some initial answers to this, but it's certainly not deployed. And there aren't really a lot of choices, and we do live in a hyper-capitalist world where it feels like you don't have a lot of choice, between a Google device or an Apple device, where people, when companies together just take all the data that they can. And the two people I met from Guyana, actually, are some people that really, for me, gave me some hope, because they did something that's very smart. They understood, and I think I'm representing you correctly, they understood that the surveillance is real. And so they use the surveillance to their benefit. They don't trust their electronic devices. Instead, they know that people that are listening have to act on the information. So they use their phones as a sort of side channel to the authorities. We're going to have a big march. It's going to have this many people. We're going to have these things take place at the march. And the authorities hear it in real time. And the authorities have to make guesses about what's true and what's not true. I think that's a good strategy, and I think it's one that's worth adopting, is knowing that you're going to take countermeasures and they're going to fail, and you need to plan for them to fail in a way that is advantageous to you. So an example of this is with Edward Snowden, actually, and I'm very sorry about what has happened with Evo Morales lately, and what is going on with the military coup in Bolivia. Although that might be controversial to say that it's a military coup, I think it's quite clear when the military tells you that you have to step down that that's a military coup. In the summer of Snowden, Snowden was in Moscow. You probably have all heard about that. And what you probably haven't heard is that Evo Morales' airplane was flying from Moscow on its way to, in theory, I believe it was going to Ecuador, and his plane was forced down from the sky as a presidential plane, an official government plane, and then in Austria it was searched for Edward Snowden, who was not on board that airplane. Now, you might say to yourself, well, that's a weird thing, why did that happen? And I'll tell you from my perspective why it happened. We all knew that we were being surveilled. So we began to talk amongst ourselves about how wonderful it was that Evo Morales was going to help Edward Snowden. And we were so thankful. I had a crypto phone call with Julian, and I spoke with him about it, and then I picked up the other phone and called him that was not secure and said, hey, good luck with the plan. Evo's really going to come through. Oh, sorry, wrong phone. Click. And we all had these conversations, many, many, many people. And so I guess US intelligence was listening to us. Odd that, I mean, maybe it was our microwave, I'm not really sure, but they were listening, and so they demonstrated to the world that they do not care about international law, and they took a presidential plane and forced it down and then searched it looking for Edward Snowden, who was never on the airplane, and no one ever planned for him to be on that airplane. And as a result, it became clear that international law was not the law of the land. The law of the land was might is right. Julian said it in a way which I thought was perfect. He said it was as if the tide had gone out and you could see the rocks underneath the water. And it wasn't that these European countries respected Bolivia's sovereignty as a nation. It was that they understood their fealty to America. And so it was only a couple of phone calls where we understood the surveillance that caused Evo Morales' plane to go down this way. And I'm sorry to Mr. Morales for this, because I think it's probably not the nicest thing to do to the president of a small South African nation, but it demonstrated to the world what was really happening, and as a result of this, Russia granted leave for Edward Snowden to remain, because it was clear, in fact, that other countries wouldn't be able to protect him. And in some weird way, what a shame that is, by the way. I mean, Russia is, without a doubt, a place that I consider to be very authoritarian and scary in a way that exceeds even American authoritarianism that I find personally very, very scary. But it doesn't matter, actually, because what matters in this case is that they can do one good thing, and they did with Edward Snowden, by letting Edward Snowden stay alive. And I want to say that that is good, even if many other things are bad. That single action is good. And it probably wouldn't have happened without Evo Morales' unknowing help. But anyway, we can't suggest that it was our phone calls alone that did that. I'm sure that the US intelligence has lots of sources and methods that are not just our telephones. But these people from Guyana, they have the same strategy, as far as I can tell. This strategy is the right strategy. Don't trust your electronics. Your electronics are the policemen in your pocket. Don't trust cryptography, but of course don't trust things that are unencrypted either. Instead, use the different vulnerabilities as advantages. And I think that's the best bet. But using things like Facebook, using these kinds of tools, it might be a necessity for a time, but the goal of these agencies that use these tactics is to build a social graph, to figure out who the people are in that social graph, and then to put pressure on them, these kinds of pressures. So, you know, for a time, it might make sense to use something like Facebook. But for a long struggle, you don't want to use the infrastructure of an oppressor. You will only be able to operate within the oppressor's sphere of influence in that case. And it is very dangerous.
I would like to close the discussion on this. Does it make any sense to ask you for recommendations for the people who are in this room and who are fighting different struggles in terms of either methods or apps that they should be using? I mean, Edward Snowden, when he came out, he spoke about Signal, he spoke about Tails. It was 6 years ago. Is there any reason to try to update that recommendation, and are you able to do so, or should we do it in other ways than the public scene in front of cameras?
Well, I do have a lot of advice, but I also would like to say something related to this, which is the following. I helped to build part of the internet freedom world. I worked at the Tor project for a very long time, and I had a very brutal exit from the Tor project, not only because of the aforementioned accusations against me, but also because before I was accused of these things, I discovered that someone was an undercover CIA officer with a current clearance. And that's really dangerous, and it really sucks. But after that happened, the person that hired that CIA officer actually accused me also of rape. Very important detail is I never had any romantic interactions with this person at all. They withdrew the accusation pretty quickly, but the damage was already done. It laid the groundwork for later accusing me of other crimes. And so I want to say that I'm very skeptical of this 21st century statecraft that the US State Department has pushed, and the internet freedom movement as a whole. Because often what we did at the Tor project, and I'm really sad to say this, because I really believe that we did a lot of good, but often what we did is we helped Chinese dissidents jump over the Great Firewall only to get to the other side's surveillance. So we helped the Chinese dissidents to reach Facebook and Google, and then those companies have mass surveillance programs that goes directly to US intel. I met Egyptian activists in the Arab Spring, where the CIA apparently had traded information with the Egyptian intelligence services that resulted in people being tortured. So they used something like Tor, which helped them, but it helped them to do a thing which resulted in intelligence being gathered on them, and then they got tortured. I helped train people in Syria who have been executed. I think that these things are terrible. It isn't that the tool that got them executed, it was the context that got them executed. I mean, the work they were doing was dangerous and they knew it, trying to show crimes against humanity and to document them, but they used these tools. And I think you have to think about these tools as a yin and a yang. I'll give a really good example. This is really sad. I've never talked about it in public, and I'm a little uncomfortable to do it, but I kind of feel like, you know, fuck it, let's go for it. So I was brought in by the State Department, paid the Tor project to do stuff, and they asked me to go and help the Tibetan government in exile. And I went to Dharamsala and McLeod Ganj as a Tor employee. And this was just as the Snowden documents were starting to get leaked. And the State Department had just granted the Tibetan government in exile money to help rebuild their network infrastructure. And one of the things that they did was help the Tibetan government switch Tibet.net's email to Google Apps for domains. Okay, well that's interesting. So I was there and I was giving them advice, helping them to use Tor and all these other things. And what's never been said in public is not that. That I was interested in helping the Tibetans or anyone to secure their communications is not news. What's news is that the PRISM slide deck, which has been censored by the Washington Post and The Intercept, it actually includes a list of targets. And one of the, like, my absolute fucking greatest regrets of my entire miserable life is reading that slide deck and knowing what I know now, actually, which is in the list of targets. They talk about how it's often people you would never imagine that are in the PRISM database. And one of those targets is Tibet.net. To the Tibetans in the audience, I'm really sorry to tell you that news. So what happened is the US government used the internet freedom world to help people replace their infrastructure because the Chinese were breaking into their systems. And then some Google Palm, you know, they just showed up like white knights to help everybody. And the people at Google, they didn't know about PRISM, right? They didn't understand about the surveillance, not the people that really thought they were doing good things. And what happened is they went from being sometimes compromised by the Chinese to all the time compromised by US intelligence. And I helped to make that happen. On accident, without knowing it, I had the best of intentions. We were the non-violent people. We were the ones helping with information. We were the yin to their yang. And the dark side of the internet freedom movement is that the people that are gaining, we don't understand exactly how they're gaining. It's one of the things that Snowden brought out and made clear. And it's a scandal that that document has not been published in full, the PRISM slide deck, because you should know. The world should know that Tibet.net is one of the targets. This is not Al-Qaeda. It's Tibet, the Tibetan government in exile, which is struggling to have anything looking like a democracy. And I'm sure this will get my Chinese visa revoked, but whatever, you know, that's how it goes in life. But this is outrageous that the US government uses young people like I was to go and to help people that have suffered a genocide, to help them with internet freedom tools, and then actually what we've helped them to do is be 100% surveilled all of the time. What the fuck? Thanks a lot, Hillary Clinton. You know, she's the one who promoted the 21st century statecraft agenda here. They're the people at the Department of Human Rights and Labor that gave that grant to the Tibetans. So what did the people at the Department of Human Rights and Labor know? Did they know that this is what happens with Tibet? When Tibet takes their grant money to redo their network infrastructure, did they know that they were going to enable a PRISM target like that? Who cares?
Yeah,
so what's my recommendation for tools? My recommendation for tools is go get a job at these agencies. That's the answer. The only thing that's going to make it better is to actually be inside. You have to have people inside the organization defect to humanity. That's it. It's not about tools. It's not about using Signal or Tor. It's not about which iPhone or Android phone you buy or something like that. No, it's about serious dedication to fundamental human rights and democratic principles. That's what's at stake. And in order to deal with that, we can't talk about software and tools. These things are irrelevant. If you're targeted by the CIA, everything you do is owned. There's no escaping it. You're in what's called cast iron. That means everything you do is recorded. They send people into your life, that, you know, girlfriends, you know, like people who are gonna show up in your life. You'll never be able to trust a human being again as long as you've lived. Software is not gonna help you with that. The only thing that helps you with that is democracy. Real accountability. That's it. And even that, you never come back.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Thank you again to all the participants who have accepted to come with us today. We will be having a short break showing the movie of Costa Gavras on the Europe negotiations on the Greek debt, which actually it's a movie which is adapted from a book which was written because Varoufakis, the finance minister of Greece, recorded in secret the negotiations in the Eurogroup in order to be able to reveal how it actually worked from the inside and what all those political leaders were trying to hide. So I recommend you to stay. Then there will be a very important debate also, and we will continue them tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.